Take a close look at Australia, Canada, Russia, and Brazil, and you will notice a genuinely surprising pattern. These nations possess vast territories packed with endless natural resources, alongside remarkably low population densities. At first glance, they seem to hold every single advantage that defines a wealthy country. Yet, they share another undeniable trait that sets them apart. Their manufacturing sectors are surprisingly weak. Despite receiving nearly every economic blessing imaginable, these giants harbor almost no global brand that dominates international markets. Instead, raw materials like iron or crude oil grains and timber make up the vast majority of their exports. This story uncovers why these massive nations struggle to build strong factories, how an abundance of natural wealth can quietly ruin industry, and what it truly takes for manufacturing to survive. To understand this problem, we first need to define what makes a country a massive resource power. 3 clear rules shape this idea. The nation must rank among the top 10 largest territories in the world. Its population density must fall well below half the global average, and raw materials along with primary commodities must account for more than half of its total exports. A few nations satisfy all 3 conditions, including Russia, Canada, Brazil, and Australia, as well as Argentina, Kazakhstan, and Algeria. Looking at the data, Russia, Canada, Brazil, and Australia all sit comfortably within the 6 largest countries on the planet, with population densities that do not come close to global averages. According to the World Bank, Australia counts roughly 3 people per square kilometer. Canada holds about 4, Russia sits at 9, and Brazil barely reaches 25. While Argentina, Kazakhstan, and Algeria share similar traits, focusing on Australia, Canada, Russia, and Brazil reveals the pattern on a much larger economic stage. The first major obstacle comes from a well-known economic phenomenon called Dutch disease. The name traces back to 1959, when the Netherlands discovered a massive natural gas field and earned huge fortunes, exporting energy, only to watch its surging currency value completely shatter its traditional factories. It stands as a classic example of natural wealth turning into economic poison. The core mechanic is simple enough to follow. When a nation exports massive quantities of oil, iron, or natural gas, foreign money floods through the borders in endless waves. That sudden inflow drives the value of the local currency straight up into the sky. Money gains immense strength overnight, but that exact shift creates a crushing dilemma for local industry. As the home currency surges, every single product made in local factories automatically becomes far more expensive for buyers overseas. The quality of the product stays exactly the same, yet the price tag jumps so high that foreign buyers walk away, effectively blocking export routes. At the same time, cheap foreign goods pour into domestic stores and force local factory after local factory to lock their doors for good. Every time these resource giants hit a commodity boom, their manufacturing plants take a direct hit from currency rates, repeating a painful cycle where natural wealth strips away industrial strength. The second obstacle lies in a common misunderstanding. A vast territory does not mean a large market. It is easy to assume that a massive country can build more factories and sell far more goods without breaking a sweat. However, manufacturing cares very little about land size, demanding economic density instead. Factories operate on a fundamental principle, where making more goods drives down the cost of every single item. Whether building automobiles, home appliances, or smartphones, setting up a production line requires a staggering upfront investment. When output grows, the heavy costs of building facilities and funding research spread thinly across millions of finished products, lowering the final price tag in a process known as economies of scale. To keep that machine running, a country needs a massive consumer market waiting right outside the factory doors to absorb those goods. Yet, these giant resource nations hold far too few people for their land mass, leaving them with tiny domestic markets. Making matters worse, those sparse populations live scattered across key cities, separated by thousands of miles. Even if someone builds a factory, customers are not standing nearby, meaning goods must travel exhausting distances just to find a buyer. As a result, setting up large-scale production becomes nearly impossible, stripping away the biggest advantage that manufacturing has to offer. Manufacturing does not crave endless open land. It thrives in tightly packed spaces like South Korea or Taiwan, where tens of millions of buyers live side by side. For industry, a vast and empty territory acts as a massive wall that shatters markets and cuts off growth. The third obstacle comes down to the brutal cost of moving goods across huge distances. Manufacturing is never as simple as putting up a single factory and watching it run on its own. It relies on a long, delicate supply chain that must move without a single glitch, bringing in raw materials, building individual parts, assembling final products, and shipping them out to sea. When a country spans immense distances, every step in that chain stretches dangerously far apart. Iron ore must travel thousands of miles just to reach a steel mill, and the steel plates produced there must travel all over again to reach an assembly plant. Once the car is finally built, it travels yet again to reach a distant harbor. Longer distances push shipping costs higher, drag out delivery times, and force companies to store far more inventory, sending total costs skyrocketing. On the other hand, resource industries handle long distances with ease. Iron ore and crude oil travel slowly on long trains or through pipelines without losing a single bit of value. And because they move in massive bulk, companies easily cover transport expenses through simple logistics. Manufacturing enjoys no such luxury. Every stage adds heavy land transport fees, and if shipments run late, products lose their competitive edge before they even hit foreign shelves. While a massive territory works wonders for mining, it actively traps factories that desperately need suppliers, assembly lines, and ports sitting right next to each other. The fourth obstacle centers on how resource industries drain both money and talent away from factories. Once a company secures rich underground reserves, extracting resources becomes wildly profitable and incredibly stable. A small rise in the price of crude oil or iron ore yields astronomical profits, allowing energy firms to offer massive paychecks to their workers. Beyond high wages, resource extraction holds another unique advantage that factories simply cannot match. A mine or an oil field cannot pack up and leave just because labor gets expensive. Iron ore remains locked in Australian ground, and oil stays buried in Middle Eastern sand, forcing companies to dig right where the resources sit no matter how high wages climb. Resource giants willingly pay top dollar to secure workers, pulling the nation's brightest minds and heavy capital straight into mines and energy projects like a giant black hole. Manufacturing faces a completely different reality. Building plants and developing technology requires massive upfront money, alongside an uncomfortably high risk of failure in international markets. On top of that, if local wages rise too high, automobile or appliance plants can easily pack up and move to countries where labor costs far less, which happens all the time. From a business standpoint, there is little reason to stay and operate plants in a resource country where labor costs have exploded. Factories find themselves losing the fight for talent and funding right from the start. Capable engineers head straight for the oil fields, investment capital flows toward raw commodities, and manufacturing plants remain trapped in an endless loop of labor shortages and missing funds. In the end, the richer the soil, the faster factories run out of the people and money they need to survive. The fifth obstacle comes down to sheer distance from the world's primary industrial belts. Modern manufacturing no longer unfolds within the boundaries of a single country. Instead, it operates across a complex global web where different regions take on distinct roles, making parts in Asia, assembling products in North America, and selling them to buyers across Europe. To succeed in this system, a country needs to sit right next to major manufacturing hubs and trade routes where components and shipping containers flow continuously. Australia and Brazil face severe physical barriers, separated from North America, East Asia, and Western Europe by vast oceans that require lengthy transit times. Russia spans such an immense area that its own factories and domestic markets sit thousands of miles, split between East and West. Canada sits directly above the massive American market, yet building and maintaining an independent manufacturing base remains virtually impossible. In contrast, Germany sits right at the heart of Europe. South Korea and Taiwan occupy the center of East Asia's production network, and China serves as the primary hub for global assembly lines. Comparing these regions shows just how isolated Australia, Canada, Russia, and Brazil truly are, forcing their factories to pay far more money and wait much longer just to move a single component. In manufacturing, land area matters far less than proximity to the primary global industrial belt. All these challenges point directly toward a single underlying reality: the absolute necessity of industrial clusters, which form the true foundation of manufacturing. People often picture huge, isolated facilities when thinking about industry, but modern production never relies on a single plant standing alone. Building a single automobile requires more than 30,000 individual components working together. Steel suppliers produce metal sheets, electronics firms provide microchips and sensors, metal fabricators stamp out structural frames, chemical plants supply paint and plastics, logistics providers coordinate tight delivery schedules, and software developers build navigation and autonomous driving systems. Thousands of specialized suppliers must operate like a single organism just to roll one completed vehicle off the assembly line. When these supporting companies cluster tightly, within a shared geographic area. They respond instantly to shifting demands, creating the dense supplier ecosystem where true manufacturing strength originates. Within such an ecosystem, a team can develop a new prototype part and bring it to a neighboring workshop for testing on the very same day, or resolve a technical breakdown within hours. That kind of speed and density cannot be bought overnight, no matter how much capital a government pours into the ground. This dynamic exposes the exact problem confronting giant resource nations. Money and talent flow strictly toward mining sites and oil fields, leaving manufacturing suppliers scattered thousands of miles apart. Even if a company builds a factory, no supporting cluster exists nearby, turning a simple component order into a multi-day waiting period, and leaving technical problems without local experts to solve them. As a result, factories turn into isolated islands, watching their productivity and competitiveness steadily erode. Manufacturing is not merely about erecting buildings. It is about cultivating an interconnected environment where thousands of businesses, skilled workers, and technical capabilities thrive together. The combination of Dutch disease, sparse population density, heavy freight costs, brain drain, and geographic isolation creates a severe absence of industrial clusters, explaining why nations rich in land and minerals consistently fail to become manufacturing powerhouses. An empty, vast territory simply lacks the fertile ground required for such an ecosystem to take root. Faced with these economic realities, giant resource nations must find other ways to sustain their wealth, choosing between two distinct strategic paths. Some choose to abandon manufacturing early on to double down on their natural advantages, while others continue struggling to build factories against the odds. Australia and Canada chose the first path. Australia's decision carries a painful history, requiring the nation to give up a car industry that once stood as a major source of national pride. Australia used to be a legitimate automobile producer, hosting its own domestic brand Holden, alongside local plants operated by global giants like Toyota and Ford. For generations, Holden represented Australian pride, yet the harsh economics remained inescapable. The nation faced a small population, high domestic wages, and a tiny home market, suffering from every structural weakness typical of resource-rich lands. Realizing the imbalance, the government eventually cut off heavy industrial subsidies and allowed unprofitable sectors to wind down. Ford and Toyota gradually shuttered their local operations starting in 2013, and when Holden closed its Adelaide assembly plant in 2017, Australia's 70-year history of car manufacturing came to a complete end. Tens of thousands of skilled factory workers lost their jobs during a brutal period of industrial restructuring. After enduring that painful transition, Australia permanently let go of its industrial ambitions. Instead, the country built an advanced, resilient economy around raw material exports, layering finance, tourism, and high-value service industries on top of its natural wealth. Canada followed a similar trajectory through a slightly different approach. Rather than cultivating domestic manufacturing brands, Canada integrated its economy directly into the vast supply chains of the neighboring United States. American automotive and aerospace companies established facilities near the border, while Canadian firms stepped in to supply essential parts and intermediate goods. The companies that adapted to this supporting role survived, and now form the core of Canada's industrial sector, while independent domestic manufacturers slowly faded away under the weight of resource country disadvantages. This strategy bound Canadian manufacturing directly to the health of the American market, leaving domestic factories vulnerable to economic shifts and trade policy changes in Washington. Nevertheless, for Canada, this arrangement represented the most realistic and practical option available. Though Australia and Canada handled the challenge differently, both recognized the hard limits imposed by their geography, refusing to cling to an unsustainable industrial strategy, and choosing, instead, to build lasting wealth around their core strength. Russia and Brazil chose a far more difficult road, refusing to accept the structural limits of their resource-heavy economies. Both nations staked their long-term economic strategy on becoming manufacturing powerhouses, driven by a vision of exporting finished industrial goods rather than raw commodities. Russia poured heavy investment into military-industrial manufacturing, relying on its defense sector and aerospace technologies to build a self-contained industrial ecosystem. Brazil leveraged its large domestic population to fund aggressive development in automotive plants, aircraft manufacturing, and steel production, betting that heavy state backing and capital injections could overcome the hurdles of a vast territory. Yet the real-world obstacles proved far more stubborn than expected. Rising prices for crude oil, iron ore, and soybeans repeatedly triggered currency surges that damaged factory exports, while commodity downturns regularly destabilized the broader economy. Inadequate transportation infrastructure made moving components across huge distances excessively slow and expensive. Added to these hurdles, international sanctions and low foreign investment in Russia, combined with complex tax systems and heavy regulation in Brazil, prevented healthy industrial clusters from taking root. Certain specialized companies, such as the Brazilian aircraft manufacturer Embraer, have managed to achieve global success despite the odds. However, a vast gap remains between these isolated success stories and the deep industrial strength seen in nations like Germany, Japan, or South Korea. Despite these ongoing struggles, neither Russia nor Brazil has abandoned its industrial ambitions, holding on to a deep determination to build a strong manufacturing base. Yet, as decades of effort demonstrate, creating a thriving industrial ecosystem requires far more than national willpower and raw natural wealth. This brings up an obvious question. How did the United States and China become dominant global manufacturing powerhouses, despite possessing vast territories and endless natural resources? Are these two giants exceptions to the rule? Not in the slightest. At their core, both nations follow the exact same economic principles that govern every other country. The secret behind the success of the United States and China lies in how they handle their land area, avoiding the trap of spreading factories across an entire continent and choosing, instead, to concentrate industrial activity within specific regions. The United States concentrated workers, corporations, shipping ports, and supply chains inside distinct industrial corridors around the Great Lakes, the South, and the West Coast. Similarly, China packed its industrial ecosystem into massive urban clusters along its eastern seaboard. Neither nation attempted to cover every square mile of land with factories, opting instead to squeeze population and industry into concentrated zones to generate artificial density. Think of it as placing hyperdense manufacturing hubs, similar in density to South Korea or Taiwan, inside specific pockets of a massive territory. Pairing those densely packed industrial centers with massive domestic populations and huge consumer markets created the ultimate combination for manufacturing dominance. Even these industrial giants cannot fully escape the paradox that comes with managing a vast territory. In pursuit of short-term efficiency, the United States previously allowed its manufacturing supply chains to scatter across the globe, paying a heavy price as its traditional industrial ecosystems steadily broke down. This decay explains why Washington now promises massive government subsidies to pull foreign manufacturing plants back onto American soil. Even the world's most powerful economy eventually recognized that losing an industrial cluster directly threatens long-term national security and economic stability. Cultivating and protecting an industrial ecosystem remains far more difficult than simply erecting factory walls. Building a complete manufacturing network takes decades of continuous effort, yet destroying that same network takes only a moment. Once an industrial ecosystem falls apart, restoring the complex web of factories, infrastructure, and skilled labor proves nearly impossible. No matter how much capital or political power a government throws at the problem. When an industrial ecosystem exists, protecting it remains the only viable strategy.